I never imagined my own son would banish me to the basement of the house I built with my own hands. The house where I'd raised him as a single mother. The house that had been our sanctuary through decades of struggle and triumph. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. When his wealthy in-laws announced their 2-week visit, I suddenly became an inconvenience to be hidden away. My bedroom transformed into a proper guest room for people who looked down their noses at everything I'd accomplished. But what my son and his social climbing wife didn't realize was that I still held the deed to this property, and their casual cruelty would cost them the inheritance they'd been counting on. Before we continue, tell me where you're watching from in the comments. And if this story resonates with you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I remember the exact moment I understood my place in my son's new life. It was a crisp Sunday afternoon in October, the kind of autumn day in rural Vermont where the maple trees blazed with fiery colors against a cloudless sky. The air smelled of wood smoke and possibility. For 35 years, I'd owned and operated Rosewood Inn, a small bed and breakfast nestled in the Green Mountains. I'd purchased the dilapidated Victorian when Patrick was just 7 years old, after his father abandoned us for a new life in California. With nothing but determination and the small insurance settlement from my parents' accident, I'd transformed the crumbling structure into a beloved local landmark and our forever home. The wraparound porch where I'd taught Patrick to read, the garden where we'd grown vegetables during lean years, the kitchen where I'd helped him with science projects. Every corner held memories of the life we'd built together. Even after retiring and converting the inn back into a private residence 3 years ago, I'd maintained the property meticulously, taking pride in the home we'd created against all odds. Mom, we need to talk about next month. Patrick stood in my kitchen doorway, his expression uncomfortable. At 42, my son had transformed from the sensitive boy who'd helped me welcome guests into a successful investment banker whose visits home had grown increasingly infrequent. Beside him stood Vanessa, his wife of 5 years, tapping her designer boot impatiently. I'd been chopping vegetables for Sunday dinner, a tradition I desperately maintained despite their obvious reluctance to drive up from Boston for these monthly visits. Of course, dear. Is there a problem with Thanksgiving plans? I wiped my hands on my apron, noting how Vanessa's gaze swept critically over my comfortable but unfashionable kitchen. It's about Victoria's parents, Patrick began, mentioning his mother-in-law as if I should immediately understand the significance. They're coming for an extended visit from London, 2 weeks, starting next Friday. That's lovely, I said, genuinely meaning it. I'd be happy to meet them. I could prepare the blue room. Actually, Vanessa interrupted, her voice carrying that particular tone of practiced patience she reserved for me. My parents have certain expectations. They're used to specific accommodations. Patrick cleared his throat. What Vanessa means is that they'd be more comfortable in the master suite. I blinked, confused. My bedroom? It's the largest room, Mom, with the ensuite bathroom and the mountain view. They're traveling all this way, and Dad's back has been giving him trouble. Vanessa continued, already speaking as if the matter were settled. Where would I sleep? I asked, already sensing the answer. Patrick and Vanessa exchanged a glance, loaded with meaning. We've been discussing this, Patrick said carefully. The basement apartment has its own bathroom and kitchenette from when you used to rent it out. It makes the most sense. The basement apartment. The small, partially below-ground space where I'd once housed a college student who helped with breakfast service in exchange for reduced rent. A space I'd specifically stopped using because the dampness aggravated my arthritis. We'd help you move your things temporarily, Vanessa added quickly. It's just for 2 weeks, and it would mean so much to have them stay. Dad's been introducing Patrick to some significant clients. I stood silently, wooden spoon still in hand, as the reality of my position crashed over me. This wasn't a request. It was a directive. In my son's eyes, I had been demoted from matriarch to inconvenience, my comfort less important than impressing his in-laws. "I see," I said finally, turning back to my vegetables, blinking rapidly to dispel the moisture gathering in my eyes. "When do you want to start moving my things?" "This weekend would be ideal," Vanessa replied, her voice brightening now that the awkward part was over. "We could help on Saturday. I've already ordered new bedding that will better suit the room's potential." New bedding. For my room. As if my carefully selected quilt and sheets were embarrassing items to be hidden away along with me. That night, after they'd driven back to their Boston brownstone, I sat on my porch swing watching darkness settle over the mountains that had witnessed my life's greatest joys and sorrows. The property stretched before me, 3 acres of gardens and woods I'd tended through seasons of abundance and hardship. I thought about the Christmas when 10-year-old Patrick and I had been snowed in with no electricity, huddled by the fireplace, reading stories by candlelight. About the summer he'd graduated college, when we'd hosted a celebration on the lawn for 50 proud guests. About the day he'd brought Vanessa home, my initial delight at his happiness gradually tempered by her subtle suggestions for updating and modernizing what she called my quaint little place. I remembered the conversation I'd overheard 6 months ago when they thought I was napping. Vanessa asking Patrick when they might discuss the future of the property, mentioning its potential as a weekend retreat once it was appropriately renovated. My son's vague response about eventually needing to have that conversation with me. They were waiting for me to become unable to maintain my home, waiting to suggest, with practiced concern, that it was too much for me, that I would be safer and better cared for somewhere else, waiting to inherit the valuable property they already viewed as their future possession. What they didn't know, what I'd never shared with them, was that my modest inn had become considerably less modest over the years. Vermont property values had soared, and 3 different developers had approached me with substantial offers for the land and historic building. I'd always declined, assuming that one day I would pass this legacy to my son, the boy who had hammered nails alongside me. During renovations, who knew the stories behind every creaking floorboard and leaded glass window. But as I rocked gently in the growing darkness, I recognized with startling clarity that this was no longer the future I wanted for my home, or for myself. By morning, I had made my decision. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The morning light streamed through my bedroom window, the bedroom I would soon be vacating for people who had never lifted a finger to build this house. I ran my hand along the hand-carved cherry headboard that had been my 20th anniversary gift to myself, after 2 decades of running the inn alone. The thought of storing it in the basement's dampness made my chest tighten. I reached for my phone and called the one person who had always seen me clearly. "Martha, it's happening," I said when she answered, skipping the usual pleasantries. Martha had been my friend for 30 years, the local librarian who had helped me research historic restoration techniques when I'd first purchased the dilapidated Victorian. "Patrick and the princess are moving you to the basement?" Martha's voice carried equal parts outrage and resignation. I'd confided my fears to her months ago when I'd first noticed the changing dynamic with my son and daughter-in-law. For his in-laws visit. Apparently, my room has the right accommodations for people flying in from London. I tried to keep the bitterness from my voice, but failed. "You're not actually considering it, are you, Eleanor?" Martha demanded. There it was. My name spoken with the familiar mixture of affection and exasperation that only a true friend can manage. Eleanor Caldwell, owner of Rosewood Inn, mother of 1 ungrateful son, and apparently soon-to-be basement dweller. "I've been considering a lot of things," I answered carefully, making my way downstairs to put on coffee. "Remember Douglas Whitney from Green Mountain Realty? The one who kept pestering you to sell last year? The one you practically chased off the property with a broom?" Martha chuckled at the memory. I'm going to call him today. Silence stretched across the line. Eleanor, Martha finally said, are you sure about this? I gazed out my kitchen window, at the mountains that had been my constant companions through years of joy and heartbreak. I thought Patrick understood what this place means, not just its monetary value, but its soul. I was wrong. Have you talked to him about how you feel? You didn't see them, Martha. The way they discussed my bedroom as if I wasn't standing right. There. The way Vanessa talked about ordering new bedding because mine wasn't good enough for her parents. They've been mentally redesigning this house around me for years, waiting for me to become too old or infirm to notice. And selling is your answer? Martha asked gently. Not just selling, I said, the plan crystallizing as I spoke. Starting over. On my terms. After hanging up with Martha, I spent the morning making 2 important calls. The first was to Douglas. Whitney, who couldn't conceal his surprise or delight when I inquired whether those development offers were still on the table. The second was to my attorney, Rebecca Liu, who had helped me navigate the business side of the inn for decades. I want to understand all my options, I told her, and I want complete discretion. Rebecca promised to prepare the necessary documentation and advised me not to sign anything without her review. Property of this value, with this much history. We need to be thorough, Eleanor. By afternoon, I'd started methodically photographing and cataloging personal items I wanted to keep regardless of where I lived next. The family photographs, of course, the antique desk where I'd kept the inn's ledgers, quilts made by my grandmother. Small treasures that held memories no developer could put a price on. I was examining my collection of first edition New England poetry when my phone rang. Patrick's name flashed on the screen. Mom, he began without preamble. Vanessa's thinking, we should move your furniture this weekend instead of next. Her parents decided to come a few days early, and we'd need to get the room ready. No greeting, no asking how I was feeling about the arrangement. Just another demand, another adjustment I was expected to make without complaint. I see, I said, forcing neutrality into my voice. When will you be arriving? Friday evening. We thought we'd stay over, get everything moved on Saturday, then head back to Boston. The cleaners Vanessa hired will come Monday to deep clean before her parents. Arrive Tuesday. Cleaners. As if my home wasn't already immaculate. I closed my eyes, counting silently to 5. That won't be necessary, I said. Mom, I know you keep a clean house, but Vanessa feels— No, Patrick, I interrupted. I meant you don't need to move any furniture. He sighed, the familiar sound of exasperation I'd been hearing more frequently in recent years. Mom, we've been over this. It's just temporary, and it's important for— I'll stay with Martha, I said firmly. You and Vanessa can use my room however you like for the visit. Silence, followed by confusion. You'd rather stay with Martha than in your own home. The irony of his question wasn't lost on me. I'd rather not sleep in the basement of the house. I built, yes. Mom, you're being dramatic. The basement apartment is perfectly comfortable. We just thought— I know exactly what you thought, Patrick. That's the problem. Another sigh. I could picture him running his hand through his hair, the way he did when dealing with what he considered unreasonable behavior. Fine. If you prefer to stay with Martha, that's your choice. But it seems unnecessary. My choice, I repeated, latching onto those words. Yes, it is. Just like what happens to this house is my choice. Something in my tone must have alerted him. What does that mean? It means we'll talk when you arrive on Friday. I hung up before he could respond. For the next 2 days, I moved with purpose. I contacted 3 developers who had previously expressed interest in the property, arranging discreet meetings for the following week. I visited 2 upscale condominiums. In Burlington, modern spaces with mountain views and none of the maintenance concerns of a 19th century home. I opened a new bank account at a different institution than the one Patrick had recommended when helping me with financial planning last year. By Friday morning, I had transferred several boxes of irreplaceable keepsakes to Martha's spare room, along with enough clothing for a 2-week stay. Douglas Whitney had already conducted a preliminary assessment and hinted that the competing developers would likely drive the price well above initial offerings. Rebecca had prepared a folder of documents outlining various scenarios and the tax implications of each. I was ready when Patrick and Vanessa's sleek BMW pulled into my driveway at precisely 6:15 p.m. I watched from the porch swing, teacup in hand, as they emerged, my son in his casual but expensive weekend attire, Vanessa surveying the property with the calculating gaze of someone mentally measuring for new curtains. "Mom," Patrick called, his smile tight as he approached. "All packed for Martha's?" I took a deliberate sip of my tea, savoring the familiar taste of the chamomile I'd grown in my own garden. "We need to talk first." Vanessa glanced at her watch. "We were hoping to get settled and then drive into town for dinner. Could this wait until tomorrow?" "No," I said simply. "It can't." I gestured to the porch swing beside me. "Why don't you both have a seat? There's something important we need to discuss about the future of Rosewood Inn." Patrick and Vanessa exchanged glances before reluctantly settling onto the porch swing beside me. The antique wood creaked beneath us, a sound I'd always found comforting, like the house was participating in our conversations. Tonight, it felt like a witness to what was about to unfold. "Mom, is everything okay?" Patrick's voice carried concern, but I noted the undertone of impatience. Friday evening traffic from Boston had likely been brutal, and they were clearly eager to freshen up and head to whatever reservation Vanessa had undoubtedly made at the most expensive restaurant in town. "That depends on your definition of okay," I replied, setting my teacup on the small table beside me. "I've been doing a lot of thinking about this house." Vanessa immediately straightened, her attention suddenly focused. "Oh? What about it?" I looked out over the sprawling front lawn where Patrick had learned to ride a bicycle, where we'd hosted summer fundraisers for the local historical society, where I'd planted a maple sapling the day we'd moved in, now a towering guardian with branches that sheltered half the yard. When I bought this place, it was condemned. The previous owners had let it deteriorate for decades, I began, deliberately measured. The real estate agent tried to talk me out of it, said it was too much. For a single mother with a young child and limited resources, that I should buy something sensible instead. "But you were always stubborn," Patrick said with a small smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Dad used to say you could outwork and outstubborn anyone in 3 counties. The mention of Patrick's father was rare. He'd left when Patrick was 7, deciding family life in rural Vermont couldn't compete with the excitements of Los Angeles. His child support checks had been sporadic at first, then non-existent. Yes, I was stubborn, I acknowledged, and determined to create something lasting. A home for us, and a business that would sustain us. Every repair, every renovation, they were investments in our future. In your future, Patrick." Vanessa shifted uncomfortably beside my son. "And you did a remarkable job," she offered with practiced politeness. "But surely maintaining such a large property becomes challenging as one gets older." There it was, the condescension barely concealed as concern. "That's precisely what I've been considering," I said, watching Vanessa's expression transform to one of barely suppressed triumph. "The future of this property." Patrick leaned forward. "We've actually been meaning to talk to you about that, Mom. Vanessa and I think—" "I'm selling Rosewood," I interrupted. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the evening birds seemed to pause their songs. "What?" Patrick finally managed, his face draining of color. "I've contacted several developers who've expressed interest over the years. They're preparing offers. I'm meeting with them next week." Vanessa found her voice first. "But you can't just— I mean, Have you really thought this through, Eleanor? This has been your home for so long, and such decisions shouldn't be made hastily. There's nothing hasty about it, I replied calmly. I've had years to consider what this property means to me and what I want for my future. Patrick stood abruptly, pacing the length of the porch. This is because of the basement arrangement, isn't it? Mom, that was temporary. A few weeks, that's all. This isn't about the basement, Patrick. Though I admit the situation clarified some things for me. What things? He demanded. I met his gaze steadily. How you see me in your life, not as the woman who built this house and this business, but as someone whose needs can be set aside when inconvenient. Someone whose space can be rearranged without meaningful consultation. Someone who should be grateful to be included in plans, for her own home. Vanessa's perfect composure cracked slightly. That's completely unfair. We were trying to accommodate my parents while respecting your right to remain in your home. By relocating me to the basement? I raised an eyebrow. Tell me, Vanessa, did you consider any other solutions? Perhaps your parents could have stayed at the Williams Hotel in town. It's quite charming. Or maybe you could have offered them your guest room in Boston and visited them there. The flush creeping up her neck told me no such alternatives had been considered. Patrick ran a hand through his hair in frustration. Mom, you're overreacting. It was a reasonable solution to a temporary situation. The situation may be temporary, but your attitude isn't, I replied. I've watched how you both look at this house when you think I don't notice. The comments about updating and modernizing. The conversations about its potential once it's yours. His eyes widened. You heard? Yes, I heard. And I've seen. For years, I've watched you both treat this place as your future inheritance rather than my present home. By relocating me to the basement? I raised an eyebrow. Tell me, Vanessa, did you consider any other solutions? Perhaps your parents could have stayed at the Williams Hotel in town. It's quite charming. Or maybe you could have offered them your guest room in Boston and visited them there. The flush creeping up her neck told me no such alternatives had been considered. Patrick ran a hand through his hair in frustration. Mom, you're overreacting. It was a reasonable solution to a temporary situation. The situation may be temporary, but your attitude isn't, I replied. I've watched how you both look at this house when you think I don't notice. The comments about updating and modernizing. The conversations about its potential once it's yours. His eyes widened. You heard. Yes, I heard. And I've seen. For years, I've watched you both treat this place as your future inheritance rather than my present home. Vanessa stood now too, her voice taking on the professional tone she likely used in her corporate law practice. Eleanor, whatever you may have overheard was simply speculation about distant possibilities. No one is trying to take your home from you. No, I agreed, because it's mine to give or to sell as I choose, and I'm choosing to sell. Patrick's expression shifted from shock to calculation, a look I recognized from his childhood when he was rapidly reassessing a situation that hadn't gone his way. Where would you even go? He asked. This has been your home for decades. I'm looking at condominiums in Burlington. Modern, single-level living with maintenance included. Mountain views, walking distance to shops and restaurants. But that's 40 minutes from here, he protested. From us. I couldn't help the small, sad laugh that escaped me. Patrick, you live in Boston. You visit once a month, reluctantly. The distance has been there for years, just measured differently. Vanessa placed a restraining hand on Patrick's arm as he opened his mouth to argue further. Perhaps we should all take some time to think about this, she suggested smoothly. Important decisions about property shouldn't be rushed. I agree, I said, rising from the swing. Which is why I've already consulted with my attorney and financial advisor. The meetings with developers are scheduled, and I'm quite clear about what I want. Patrick stared at me as if seeing a stranger. All these years I assumed that you would inherit this place? I finished for him. Yes, that was my original plan too. But plans change when circumstances reveal new truths. I reached for my teacup, now cold, and turned toward the front door. You're welcome to use my room during your in-laws' visit. I'll be at Martha's. We can discuss the sale proceeds another time. The proceeds? Patrick echoed. I paused at the threshold. Yes. I've done quite well with my investments over the years, and this property is now worth considerably more than, you might imagine. I'll be very comfortable and generous despite everything. With that, I stepped inside, leaving them standing speechless on the porch of the home they had expected to inherit, but never truly understood. Inside the house, I leaned against the closed door, listening to the muffled sounds of Patrick and Vanessa's heated whispers on the porch. My heart raced uncomfortably, but beneath the anxiety was an unexpected sensation. Relief. After years of watching them mentally inventory my home during their visits, I had finally spoken the truth aloud. Moved through the familiar rooms, gathering the overnight bag I'd packed earlier and the folder of documents Rebecca had prepared. Through the side window, I watched Patrick gesturing emphatically while Vanessa appeared to be typing furiously on her phone, likely researching property laws or calling her father for advice. The thought almost made me smile. Vanessa's father, a banking executive, had always treated me with the careful politeness one reserves for service personnel. Just as I reached for my car keys, my phone rang. Martha. Well, did you tell them? She demanded without preamble. I did. I sank into my favorite armchair, suddenly exhausted. And? They're still on the porch, looking like I've just informed them the world is actually flat. Martha's rich laugh warmed me through the phone. Good. Let them process. Are you coming over now? On my way. Unless... I hesitated. Do you think I should stay and hash this out tonight? Absolutely not, Martha said firmly. You've dropped your bombshell. Let them sit with it overnight. Strategic retreats are sometimes the wisest course. Martha had been an Army colonel's daughter before becoming a librarian. Her tactical thinking had saved me from numerous ill-considered confrontations over the years. You're right, I agreed, rising and grabbing my bags. I'll use the side door. 10 minutes later, I was driving the familiar route to Martha's cozy Cape Cod on the other side of town. Twilight was settling over the mountains, painting them in deepening shades of purple. For decades, this view had been my constant companion, the backdrop to my life's work. The thought of leaving it created a hollow ache beneath my breastbone. But as I pulled into Martha's driveway, I reminded myself that the mountains would still be there, visible from a different window. What I was leaving behind were walls that had begun to feel like a mausoleum to memories my son no longer valued. Martha opened her door before I could knock, enveloping me in a tight hug that smelled of cinnamon and old books. You magnificent creature, she murmured into my hair. I've got wine breathing and lasagna in the oven. Her living room was the perfect antidote to the tension I'd left behind. Walls lined with bookshelves, comfortable furniture arranged for conversation rather than appearance, and decades of friendship infused into every corner. So, she said, handing me a generous glass of Merlot, tell me everything. I recounted the conversation while Martha listened intently, her expression shifting between outrage and satisfaction. The look on Vanessa's face when I mentioned the developers, I concluded, like I'd violated some unspoken agreement. Because you had, Martha noted, refilling our glasses, the agreement that mothers should sacrifice endlessly and then conveniently disappear when they're no longer useful. That's harsh, I protested, though not convincingly. Is it? How many times have they mentioned senior living facilities just so you're aware of options? How often does Vanessa comment on tasks that must be so difficult to manage alone? She had me there. The subtle campaign had been building for years, disguised as concern. What I don't understand, I said softly, is when Patrick changed. He used to love that house for what it represented: our struggle, our survival, our achievement. Now he just sees it as an asset. Martha's expression softened. People change when their circumstances change. Patrick married into money and status. Suddenly, his humble beginnings became something to overcome rather than celebrate. My phone buzzed with an incoming text. Patrick, we need to discuss this further. This is impulsive and you're not thinking clearly. Can we meet tomorrow morning? Showed Martha the message and her eyebrows rose. Not thinking clearly? That's rich, coming from the boy who thought relegating his mother to the basement was a reasonable solution. Before I could respond, another text arrived. Vanessa's parents have spent a lot of money on these plane tickets. We can't just cancel their visit. The absurdity of his concern, focusing on his in-laws' travel plans rather than my decision to sell my home, struck me like a physical blow. He still doesn't get it, I whispered. Martha squeezed my hand. No, he doesn't. And that's precisely why you're making the right decision. I typed a measured response. I have no intention of disrupting your in-laws' visit. As I said, you're welcome to use my room. I'll be staying with Martha until after they leave. We can discuss the sale once they've returned to London. His reply was immediate. This is completely unnecessary. The basement apartment is perfectly adequate. You're overreacting. I set the phone aside without responding. Some messages answered themselves through their very content. You know he's going to try to talk you out of this, Martha warned, serving up generous portions of lasagna. They both will. They've probably spent half the evening calculating the potential inheritance they're about to lose. I know, I sighed. But I'm not changing my mind. I've given enough. Years maintaining a house too large for one person because I thought Patrick would want it someday. Keeping his childhood bedroom exactly as he left it until he finally told me to update it to something more practical when he was 35. Enduring Vanessa's thinly veiled suggestions about modernizing spaces that hold decades of memories for me. Martha raised her glass. To reclaiming your life, to recognizing that the rest of your story belongs to you, not to ungrateful children, or their social climbing spouses. I clinked my glass against hers, warmth spreading through me that had nothing to do with the wine. To new beginnings. And to friends who remind us of who we really are when others try to diminish us. Later, tucked into Martha's comfortable guest room, I scrolled through photos of the Burlington condominiums I'd viewed, light-filled spaces with modern conveniences, elevator access, and balconies overlooking either Lake Champlain or the mountains. Places where I could begin again, surrounded only by what I chose to bring with me. My phone buzzed once more. A text from an unexpected source, Rebecca Liu, my attorney. Douglas Whitney called. Preliminary interest from developers exceeding expectations. Apparently, historic properties with established business potential are even more valuable now. Let's meet Monday to review options. And Eleanor, I'm proud of you. I set the phone aside with a smile. Tomorrow would bring more confrontation, more attempts to change my mind. But tonight, I allowed myself to feel the first stirrings of excitement about the future. A future I was choosing for myself. Morning arrived with the distinctive clarity of Vermont autumn, frost kissing the edges of Martha's garden, sunlight catching on the red and gold leaves outside my window. For a moment, disoriented in the unfamiliar room, I felt a pang of homesickness for my own bedroom with its eastern exposure that captured the dawn. Then I remembered that bedroom was currently being transformed to Vanessa's exacting standards for her parents' comfort. Martha was already in the kitchen when I wandered downstairs, her gray hair pulled into its usual practical bun, hands wrapped around a steaming mug of coffee. 7 missed calls, I announced, holding up my phone. 5 from Patrick, 2 from Vanessa. Starting when? Martha asked, sliding a mug of coffee toward me. The first at 6:15 a.m. I settled at her kitchen table, breathing in the comforting aroma of dark roast and cinnamon. Of course. Heaven forbid they respect normal waking hours, Martha muttered. What's their strategy? Based on the voicemails, Patrick has moved from disbelief to bargaining. Lots of, we need to discuss this rationally, and there are alternatives we haven't considered. I stirred honey into my coffee. Vanessa's messages are more direct, something about the family legacy and hasty decisions that affect multiple generations. Martha snorted. Family legacy? They visit once a month under duress. If that property meant anything to them beyond its monetary value, they'd have shown it long before now. She was right, of course. Patrick hadn't helped plant the garden in years, hadn't participated in the annual maintenance the old house required, hadn't even attended the town's historical society meetings where Rosewood Inn was often discussed, as a model of restoration. My phone buzzed again. Patrick. You should answer eventually, Martha advised. On your terms, when you're ready. I nodded but set the phone aside. After breakfast, and after I've called Rebecca about Monday's meeting. We ate in companionable silence. Martha's homemade. Granola and fresh berries, a far cry from my usual leisurely Saturday breakfast of Belgian waffles and the newspaper. Another small sacrifice, but temporary. I was helping Martha clear the dishes when a knock at the front door startled us both. Through the window, I caught sight of a sleek black BMW. They found me. I sighed. Martha squared her shoulders. Want me to send them away? I considered it for a moment, then shook my head. No. Better to face this directly. But when Martha opened the door, it wasn't Patrick or Vanessa who stood on the porch. Instead, a tall, distinguished-looking man, with silver hair and an impeccably tailored casual jacket, waited with the straight-backed posture of someone accustomed to commanding attention. Mrs. Caldwell? He inquired, his British accent crisp. I'm Geoffrey Harrington, Vanessa's father. Martha shot me a questioning look. I nodded slightly, and she reluctantly stepped aside to allow him entry. I apologize for the intrusion, he continued, stepping into Martha's cozy living room and glancing around with the careful neutrality of someone determined not to reveal their impressions. Patrick mentioned you were staying with a friend. Martha Stevens. Martha introduced herself with a coolness that would have made her Colonel father proud. Eleanor and I were just having coffee. Would you care for some, Mr. Harrington? That would be lovely. Thank you, he replied with practiced politeness. Once Martha had retreated to the kitchen, though I knew she'd be listening from just beyond the doorway, Geoffrey turned to me with a directness that was surprisingly refreshing. After months of Patrick and Vanessa's careful maneuvering, my daughter is quite distressed, he stated simply. She called us in London at what must have been midnight your time, explaining there was a situation regarding your property. I raised an eyebrow. And she sent you to handle this situation? Flicker of something, amusement perhaps, crossed his face. Actually, no. Victoria and I arrived early, last night instead of Tuesday. We're at the Williams Hotel in town. Patrick and Vanessa don't know I'm here. This surprised me. Then why are you? Geoffrey settled into the armchair across from me, his posture relaxed but still maintaining a certain formality. Professional curiosity, initially. I've spent 40 years in banking and investment, Mrs. Caldwell. When my daughter frantically explains that her mother-in-law is making an irrational financial decision, my first question is it actually irrational or simply inconvenient for my daughter? Despite myself, I felt a reluctant smile tugging at my lips. And your assessment? I haven't made one yet, he replied honestly. That's why I'm here. To understand the situation from your perspective, not filtered through Vanessa's rather specific worldview. Martha returned with coffee for Geoffrey and fresh cups for us, setting them on the side table with more force than strictly necessary. Thank you, Geoffrey acknowledged. Now, Mrs. Caldwell. Eleanor, please. Eleanor, I understand you're considering selling your property rather than maintaining it for eventual inheritance. Patrick seems to believe this is a sudden decision made in response to some disagreement about sleeping arrangements. I couldn't help the short laugh that escaped me. Is that how they've framed it? A disagreement about sleeping arrangements? Gathered there was more to the story, Jeffrey said dryly. They did mention you were asked to relocate to the basement apartment during our visit. Asked isn't precisely the term I would use, I replied. And yes, that situation crystallized. Certain realities I've been avoiding for some time, but it wasn't the cause of my decision. What was? He asked, with what seemed like genuine interest. I studied him for a moment. This man who had raised Vanessa to value status and appearance above all else, yet who had sought me out to hear my side rather than automatically supporting his daughter's position. The recognition that I've been living my life around a fantasy, I said finally. The fantasy that maintaining this property for Patrick was an act of love that he valued, rather than an expectation he'd grown to take for granted. Jeffrey nodded slowly. And the sale? Is it a practical financial decision or… Partially, I admitted. The maintenance on a house that size is considerable, but more importantly, it's about reclaiming my future. Creating a life based on what I want now, not preserving something for someone who doesn't truly appreciate its significance. Jeffrey sipped his coffee, his expression thoughtful. I understand that sentiment better than you might expect, Eleanor. Martha, who had been silently monitoring our exchange with narrowed eyes, finally spoke up. Do you? Because from where I'm sitting, you and your daughter seem cut from the same entitled cloth. Rather than taking offense, Jeffrey surprised us both by chuckling. A fair observation, given the limited information you have. But there's a reason Victoria and I arrived early and chose to stay at a hotel rather than immediately descending on your home, Eleanor. Which is? I prompted. We've had our own awakening, shall we say, regarding our daughter's expectations and behavior. Jeffrey's expression turned reflective as he set his coffee cup down. Victoria and I have watched our daughter's evolution over the years with increasing concern. When Vanessa married Patrick, we were pleased. He seemed grounded, kind, qualities our daughter sometimes lacks due to her upbringing, for which we bear responsibility. Martha made a small sound of surprise, but Jeffrey continued uninterrupted. Last Christmas we visited them in Boston. Their home is immaculate, expensive, and entirely without personality. A showcase rather than a sanctuary. Throughout our stay, we observed how Vanessa spoke about your home, Eleanor. Not with affection or respect, but as an inconvenient inheritance, waiting to be claimed and transformed. I nodded slowly, recognition washing over me. That's exactly it. Then, last month, Jeffrey continued, Victoria overheard Vanessa on a video call with Patrick, discussing ways to accelerate the timeline for acquiring your property. The suggestions were troubling. Creating documentation of minor memory, lapses, exaggerating concerns about your ability to maintain the home, essentially manufacturing a case for why you shouldn't continue living independently. My stomach clenched. I'd suspected something similar, but hearing it confirmed was still devastating. That's despicable, Martha exclaimed, her protective instincts flaring. Yes, Jeffrey agreed simply. It is. Victoria was horrified. We raised Vanessa with many advantages, but we never intended to create someone who would manipulate an elder's living situation for financial gain. He looked directly at me, particularly not someone who had provided so much for her husband. So you came early, I said, understanding dawning. Without telling them. To assess the situation ourselves, he confirmed. Victoria and I discussed it at length. If Vanessa was exaggerating concerns about your capabilities, we wanted no part in that deception. If she was planning to use our visit as leverage to displace you within your own home, which appears to be exactly what happened, we needed to intervene. Martha still looked skeptical. And you chose to stay at the hotel instead of participating in their scheme. Precisely. Though I must admit, the Williams Hotel is quite charming. I've already recommended it to several colleagues. His attempt at lightening the moment was appreciated, though the gravity of the situation remained. What will you tell them? I asked. Jeffrey straightened, resuming his more formal bearing. The truth. That Victoria and I will not be party to their manipulations. That we're perfectly comfortable at the hotel and had never expected or desired. That you be inconvenienced on our behalf. I studied this unexpected ally, trying to reconcile the man before me with the image Vanessa had cultivated of her imposing, status-conscious father. There's more, he added, looking slightly uncomfortable for the first time. I took the liberty of researching property values in this area. Your inn, with its historical significance and acreage, is quite valuable. I'm aware, I replied, thinking of the developer meeting scheduled for Monday. If you are determined to sell, and I wouldn't presume to advise you either way, I know several reputable historical preservation investors who might be interested. People who would maintain the property's character rather than subdividing it for maximum profit. This was unexpected. Why would you help me with this? Jeffrey's expression softened slightly. Consider it a small atonement for my daughter's behavior, and perhaps a selfish desire to preserve a beautiful piece of architectural history. He reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a business card. My direct number is on the back. If you'd like introductions to these investors, I'm at your disposal. As he stood to leave, I found myself reassessing everything I'd assumed about Vanessa's parents. Thank you for coming, Jeffrey, and for your candor. One doesn't reach my age without learning that honesty saves considerable time, he replied, with the ghost of a smile. Victoria and I would still like to meet you properly, perhaps for dinner one evening. On neutral territory, of course. I'd like that, I said, surprised to find I meant it. After Jeffrey departed, Martha and I sat, in stunned silence. Well, Martha finally said, that was unexpected. Indeed, I agreed, still processing the conversation. Apparently, Vanessa didn't inherit her manipulative tendencies from her father. Or perhaps he's playing a longer game, Martha suggested. Ever cautious. Though I must admit, he seemed genuine. My phone buzzed again, Patrick for the 8th time that morning. With newfound resolve, I answered. Mom, finally. We've been calling all morning. Where are you? His voice carried that familiar mix of concern and exasperation that had become his default tone with me in recent years. Exactly where I told you I'd be, at Martha's, I replied calmly. How are the renovations to my bedroom coming along? A pause. That's what I'm calling about. We've been thinking about the situation, and there might be alternatives we haven't considered. Such as? Maybe we could put my in-laws in the blue guest room after all. It's not ideal, but unnecessary, I interrupted. I just had a very enlightening conversation with Jeffrey. He and Victoria are quite comfortable at the Williams Hotel and have no intention of displacing me in my own home. The silence that followed spoke volumes. Jeffrey was there, at Martha's. Patrick finally managed, panic evident in his voice. Yes, we had a lovely chat about property values, historical preservation, and the appropriate way to treat family members. My voice remained steady, though my heart raced with a strange exhilaration. He mentioned some concerning conversations he'd overheard about accelerating timelines for acquiring my property. Mom, that's not, I never… Patrick stumbled over his words. Save it, I said, not unkindly. I'm not interested in denials or explanations right now. What I am interested in is moving forward with clarity and honesty. My meeting with the developer stands. If you'd like to be present when I review offers, that's your choice. This is happening too fast, he protested. You can't just decide something this important overnight. I didn't, I replied. This decision has been forming for years, Patrick. Every time you dismissed my attachment to this house as sentimentality. Every time Vanessa suggested modernizing spaces that hold significant memories for me. Every time you both treated my home as a temporary inconvenience in your inheritance plan, rather than the culmination of my life's work. His breathing was audible through the phone. When he spoke again, his voice carried a note I hadn't heard in years. Vulnerability. "I never meant to make you feel that way," he said quietly. For a moment, my resolve wavered. This was my son, the boy I'd raised alone, whose small hand had once fit so perfectly in mine. But then I remembered the basement apartment, the casual dismissal of my needs, the years of subtle undermining. Intent and impact are different things, Patrick. What you meant and what you did created very different outcomes, I said gently but firmly. "I'll be staying at Martha's until after your in-laws leave. We can talk about next steps then." "Mom." "Goodbye, Patrick. Give my best to Vanessa." I ended the call, feeling oddly lightheaded. Martha reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "That," she said with evident satisfaction, "was masterful." "It was terrifying," I admitted. "But necessary." Martha refilled our coffee cups. "What now? Will you really consider Jeffrey's historical preservation investors?" I thought about it as I warmed, my hands around the mug. Maybe. The idea of Rosewood being maintained rather than gutted holds appeal. But first I need to see what options Rebecca has lined up for Monday. "And Patrick?" I sighed, the weight of decades of motherhood heavy on my shoulders. "He's my son. I'll always love him. But loving him doesn't mean sacrificing my dignity or my future. Whatever happens with the property, our relationship needs to change." Martha nodded, understanding in her eyes. "The hardest lesson of parenthood. You raise them to be independent, but you never expect that independence to include dismissing everything you value." "Exactly." I gazed out Martha's kitchen window at the mountains, the same peaks visible from my own home, but from a slightly different angle. "You know what's strange? Now that I've decided to sell, I feel grief, yes, but also excitement. Like I've been carrying this enormous weight of expectations for so long that I'd forgotten what it feels like to choose freely." "Freedom suits you," Martha observed. "So, does righteous indignation?" That startled a laugh from me. "Does it?" "Absolutely. I've been waiting 30 years for you to get properly angry instead of always accommodating everyone else's needs. It's refreshing." She lifted her coffee cup in a toast. "To Eleanor Caldwell, finally putting herself first." I clinked my cup, against hers, aware that whatever happened next, whether Rosewood sold to developers or historical preservationists, whether Patrick came to understand my decision or resented it forever, I had crossed a threshold. For the first time since becoming a mother at 23, I was making a life-altering choice based solely on what I wanted for my future, not what others expected of me. The realization was both terrifying and exhilarating, like standing at the edge of a precipice with wings I'd never used before. But as the morning sunlight streamed through Martha's kitchen window, painting the room in golden light, I found myself ready, eager, even, to leap. The remainder of the weekend passed with surprising tranquility. Patrick didn't call again, though Vanessa sent a terse text Sunday afternoon. "We should discuss this situation as adults. My parents would like to meet you properly." I responded simply, "I've already spoken with your father. Dinner later this week would be lovely." Her reply came hours later, a single word. "Fine." Martha and I spent Sunday afternoon visiting a farmer's market, deliberately avoiding both my house and the upscale shopping district where Patrick and Vanessa might be entertaining her parents. The simple pleasure of selecting fresh vegetables and artisanal cheese without constantly calculating what would impress potential guests felt luxurious. "Have you thought about what you'll do after selling?" Martha asked as we browsed a display of handmade pottery. Besides the condo in Burlington, I mean. I picked up a delicate blue glazed mug, testing its weight in my hand. I'm considering taking that Mediterranean cruise I've been putting off for 15 years. The one Patrick always said was too expensive? Martha's eyebrows rose. The very same. I purchased the mug, a small act of defiance against years of careful budgeting. Maybe I'll even fly business class. Martha laughed. Good Lord, Eleanor. Next, you'll be buying designer handbags and sports cars. Don't tempt me, I grinned, feeling lighter than I had in months. By Monday morning, the weight had returned. Not the burden of others' expectations, but the gravity of the decisions before. Me. I dressed carefully for my meeting with Rebecca, choosing a tailored navy suit I'd purchased for a historical preservation award ceremony years earlier. The message was subtle, but clear. I was a professional woman conducting important business, not an elderly mother to be managed. Martha insisted on driving me to Rebecca's office in town. For moral support, she claimed, though I suspected she was also burning with curiosity. You don't need to wait, I told her as she pulled into the parking lot of the low brick building that housed Rebecca's law practice. This could take a while. Are you kidding? I've invested 30 years in this friendship. I'm not missing the climax. She patted my hand. I'll take a walk, find us some decent coffee, and meet you back here. Text when you're wrapping up. Rebecca's office reflected her personality. Efficient, elegant, with just enough personal touches to convey warmth without distraction. Family photos in simple frames, fresh flowers in a crystal vase, law books arranged by frequency of reference rather than for show. Eleanor, she greeted me with genuine warmth, rising from behind her desk. At 55, Rebecca carried herself with the confidence of someone who had built her practice from scratch in a town that initially resisted a female attorney. You're looking formidable today. That was the intention, I admitted, settling into the chair across from her. It's working. Now, let's discuss your options. She opened a leather portfolio containing several neatly arranged documents. I've received preliminary inquiries from 3 developers following Douglas Whitney's outreach. All are substantial, but they have different approaches. For the next hour, Rebecca walked me through the offers with methodical precision. The first developer proposed luxury condominiums targeting wealthy out-of-state buyers seeking Vermont vacation homes. The second envisioned an exclusive retreat center for corporate conferences and wellness programs. The third, most interestingly, suggested a mixed-use development that would preserve the main house as a boutique hotel while adding upscale residences on the surrounding acreage. All 3 are prepared to make formal offers significantly above market value, Rebecca concluded. The bidding will likely drive the price even higher. I absorbed this information, trying to separate financial considerations from emotional attachments. What about potential historical preservation investors? I've had an unexpected suggestion in that direction. Rebecca's eyebrows rose slightly. From Jeffrey Harrington, by any chance? It was my turn to be surprised. How did you know? Small town? She reminded me with a slight smile. The distinguished British gentleman asking about historical property investments at the Chamber of Commerce breakfast this morning was rather conspicuous. He mentioned knowing you. He's Vanessa's father, I explained. It's complicated. Family. Matters usually are, Rebecca acknowledged. If you're interested in preservation options, I can certainly research credible organizations. The financial return might be somewhat lower, but there would be significant tax advantages. And of course, the emotional benefit of knowing Rosewood would maintain its character. I nodded, running my fingers along the edge of her desk. I'd like to explore that avenue alongside the development offers. Rebecca made a note in her elegant handwriting. I'll arrange it. Now, there's another matter we should discuss, the timing of disclosure to Patrick. My stomach tightened. What are my obligations there? Legally, none at this stage. The property is solely in your name. However, she chose her next words carefully. Family complications tend to become legal complications when significant assets are involved. Clear communication now might prevent difficulties later. You mean he might contest the sale if he feels blindsided? It's a possibility, she acknowledged. Not necessarily with legal merit, but potentially with enough nuisance value to complicate the process. I considered this, remembering Patrick's reaction to the news, the disbelief, the calculation. He knows I'm meeting with developers. I've been transparent about my intentions. That's good, Rebecca nodded. I would suggest continuing that transparency. Perhaps include him in one of our meetings once we have firm offers to review. The idea of Patrick sitting in this office, watching as I negotiated the sale of what he'd always considered his future inheritance, created a complicated mix of emotions: vindication, apprehension, and a lingering sadness for what our relationship had become. I'll consider it, I said finally. For now, let's focus on gathering all possible options. As I left Rebecca's office an hour later, my phone chimed with a text from Martha. At the coffee shop around the corner. Join me? The Bell Jar Cafe was one of those quintessential Vermont establishments: locally roasted coffee, baked goods made with regional ingredients, and comfortable seating designed for lingering conversations. Martha had claimed a corner table by the window, a ceramic mug steaming before her. Well, she demanded as I settled into the chair across from her. Are you a millionaire yet? Not officially, I laughed, accepting the latte she'd ordered for me. But the preliminary numbers are significant, more than I'd hoped. Martha leaned forward eagerly. Enough for that Mediterranean cruise in first class? Business class, I corrected. And yes, with plenty left over. But there might be another option I hadn't considered. I explained Jeffrey's suggestion about historical preservation investors, watching Martha's expression shift from skepticism to reluctant interest. Would that mean less money? She asked practically. Potentially, but also the knowledge that Rosewood would continue in some form resembling what it has been, the main house preserved, the gardens maintained. I sipped my latte, surprised by how much that possibility appealed to me. I'm not decided. Rebecca's researching options. Martha studied me thoughtfully. You know what this tells me? Despite everything, you still care deeply about that house. Of course I do, I acknowledged. 35 years of my life are in those walls. The issue was never about not loving Rosewood. It was about not being valued within it, Martha finished, for me. About being treated as temporary caretaker rather than permanent owner. Exactly. The cafe door opened, bringing a rush of autumn air and an unexpected figure, Vanessa, immaculately dressed in a camel-colored coat that probably cost more than my entire wardrobe. She spotted us immediately, hesitating before approaching our table with determined steps. Eleanor, she greeted me with careful politeness. Martha, I hope I'm not interrupting. Just catching up, Martha replied, her expression neutral but watchful. Would you care to join us? I shot Martha a quick glance, surprised by the invitation, but she gave an almost imperceptible shrug. Know thy enemy, her eyes seemed to say. Vanessa hesitated before sliding gracefully into the empty chair at our table. Thank you. I was just picking up coffee before heading back to the house. Patrick is showing my parents around town. How nice, I commented, keeping my tone pleasant but non-committal. I trust they're enjoying their stay at the Williams Hotel. A flicker of discomfort crossed Vanessa's perfectly composed features. Yes, my father mentioned you two had spoken. We had a very enlightening conversation, I confirmed. Vanessa set her untouched coffee cup on the table, her manicured fingers gripping it tightly. I believe there have been some misunderstandings, on all sides. Have there? I asked, my tone mild, but my gaze direct. Martha shifted slightly beside me, a subtle reminder of her support. Vanessa glanced between us, clearly recognizing she was outnumbered. "Patrick is very upset," she said finally, changing tactics. "He feels this decision about selling the house is being made without proper consideration of his attachment to his childhood home." I couldn't help the small laugh that escaped me. His attachment? The same attachment that has him visiting reluctantly once a month? The same attachment that didn't prevent him from suggesting I move to the basement so your parents could have my bedroom? Vanessa's cheeks flushed slightly. That was a misguided suggestion. "We should have considered alternatives." "Yes," I agreed simply. "You should have." A moment of uncomfortable silence stretched between us, broken only by the gentle hiss of the espresso machine behind the counter. I studied my daughter-in-law with new clarity, seeing beyond her perfect appearance to the insecurity beneath. The desperate need for status, for control, for validating her choices through acquisition and display. "I met with my attorney this morning," I said finally. "The property is likely worth considerably more than even I had anticipated." Vanessa's expression remained carefully neutral, but I caught the flicker of calculation in her eyes. "I'm sure Patrick would like to be included in those discussions. As your son, he has a natural interest in—" "My son has an interest," I interrupted gently. "But not a claim. There's a difference, Vanessa." Our eyes met, a moment of perfect understanding passing between us. For perhaps the first time since I'd known her, we were speaking honestly, without the veneer of polite fiction that had characterized our relationship. "I see," she said finally. "Perhaps we could discuss this further, as a family. Over dinner, perhaps? My parents would still like to meet you properly." I considered this, weighing the potential for genuine reconciliation against the possibility of further manipulation. But something in Vanessa's expression, a resignation perhaps, or the dawning recognition that her carefully laid plans had crumbled, suggested the invitation might be offered in good faith. "Dinner would be lovely," I agreed. "Thursday evening? Perhaps. I have appointments the next few days. Thursday works." Vanessa stood, gathering her composure along with her coffee cup. "I'll make reservations at Giovanni's for 7. After she departed, Martha let out a low whistle. "Well, that was fascinating. What just happened?" I watched through the window as Vanessa walked to her car, her posture perfect, but her steps less confident than usual. I think Vanessa just recognized that the power dynamic has shifted, and she's recalculating. "Do you trust her suddenly cooperative attitude?" "Not entirely," I admitted. "But I'm curious to see where it leads." Martha raised her mug in a small toast. "To curiosity, and to watching Vanessa try to navigate a situation she can't control with money or social manipulation." I clinked my mug against hers, a small smile playing at my lips. "It should be an interesting dinner, if nothing else." Tuesday morning brought an unexpected email from Douglas Whitney with preliminary figures from the developers. The numbers made me catch my breath, substantially higher than even Rebecca's optimistic projections. I forwarded the email to her with a simple message: "We should discuss these before Thursday's dinner." Her response came within minutes. "My office, 2 p.m. today? This changes things." I called Martha immediately. "Can you believe people would pay this much for an old Victorian in rural Vermont?" "The world has gone mad," Martha agreed after I shared the figures. "But that madness works in your favor this time. What will you do with all that money?" It was a question I hadn't fully considered until that moment. My needs had always been modest. The inn had provided a comfortable living, and my investments had ensured a secure retirement. But this level of financial freedom opened possibilities I'd never seriously entertained. "I have no idea," I admitted. "Travel, certainly. Maybe set up some kind of educational fund for local students interested in historical preservation or hospitality management. Noble, Martha approved. But don't forget the sports car, I laughed. I'll add it to the list. After hanging up, I sat at Martha's kitchen table, staring into my cooling coffee. The reality of what was happening, selling my beloved home, starting over at 68, reimagining my future entirely, suddenly felt overwhelming. For 35 years, I had been Eleanor Caldwell of Rosewood Inn. Without that identity, who would I become? The moment of existential panic was interrupted by a text from an unexpected source. Jeffrey Harrington. Victoria and I would like to invite you to lunch today. Nothing formal, just an opportunity to talk without the complications of Thursdays. Dinner? The Maple Tree Cafe at noon? I hesitated only briefly before responding. That would be lovely. I'll see you there. The Maple Tree Cafe was a local institution, known for farm-to-table cuisine and a spectacular view of the mountains from its terrace. I arrived a few minutes early, oddly nervous about this meeting with the parents of the woman who had caused me so much recent distress. Jeffrey and Victoria were already seated at a corner table, both rising as I approached. Jeffrey I recognized from our previous meeting, but Victoria was a revelation. A tall, elegant woman with silver-streaked dark hair and an air of natural authority that immediately commanded respect. Seeing her, I better understood Vanessa's obsession with appearance and status, though Victoria carried hers with an effortless grace her daughter had never mastered. "Eleanor," Victoria greeted me, extending her hand. Her accent matched her husband's, crisp and cultured. "I'm delighted to finally meet you properly. I've heard so much about Rosewood over the years. All of it filtered through Vanessa's particular lens, I imagine," I replied with a small smile as I settled into the chair opposite them. Victoria's answering smile held a hint of rueful acknowledgement. "Indeed, which is precisely why we wanted this opportunity to speak with you directly. Jeffrey has shared your conversation from the weekend, and I must say I owe you an apology. This was unexpected." "For what exactly?" "For accepting Vanessa's characterization of you and your home without question. For not insisting on staying at a hotel from the beginning. For allowing our daughter to use our visit as leverage in what appears to be a calculated attempt to diminish your position in your own home." Victoria's directness was refreshing after years of Vanessa's careful manipulations. "Thank you," I said simply, "though I'm curious why you're telling me this now." "Jeffrey," and Victoria exchanged glances. "Because we owe you more than a polite fiction at Thursday's dinner," Jeffrey explained. "And because we believe you should understand the full context of what's been happening." The server arrived to take our orders, providing a brief respite from what was clearly going to be a more significant conversation than I'd anticipated. After selecting the heirloom tomato salad and fresh-caught trout, I turned my attention back to Jeffrey and Victoria. What context am I missing? Victoria leaned forward slightly. Vanessa has been dissatisfied with her life for some time. The Boston home, Patrick's career success, their social position, none of it has brought her the sense of security or fulfillment she expected. "So she fixated on Rosewood as the missing piece?" I suggested. "Partially," Jeffrey acknowledged. "But it's more complicated. Vanessa has always measured her worth through acquisition and status. Our fault, perhaps, for emphasizing material success during her formative years." Victoria nodded in agreement. "When she began describing Rosewood as their future country estate, a place for entertaining, for establishing themselves as patrons of rural Vermont life, we recognized a pattern we've seen before. Vanessa believing that the next acquisition, the next status symbol, would finally make her feel complete. And Patrick has been drawn into this pattern," I said, not as a question, but as the sad confirmation of what I'd observed. "He appears to have adopted her values," Jeffrey confirmed gently, "though from what we've observed, not entirely comfortably." "What do you mean?" Victoria considered her words carefully. During their last visit to London, we noticed moments when Patrick seemed conflicted. When Vanessa would speak disparagingly about the quaintness of Rosewood or suggest dramatic renovations, he would grow quiet, uncomfortable. Yet he never contradicted her, I pointed out, the familiar ache of disappointment resurging. No, Jeffrey agreed. He did not. But neither did he share her enthusiasm for what she called unleashing the property's potential. The server returned. With our salads, the briefly interrupted conversation giving me time to absorb this new perspective on my son's behavior. Had there been signs of internal conflict I'd missed, too hurt by his apparent dismissal of everything I valued to notice his ambivalence? "Why are you telling me this?" I asked finally, once we were alone again. "What difference does Patrick's private discomfort make if his actions align with Vanessa's plans?" Victoria reached across the table, her hand hovering near mine in a gesture of tentative connection. "Because we thought you should know that the boy you raised may still exist, beneath the man he's become, and because we want to be transparent about our position regarding your home. Which is? We believe you should do exactly what serves your interests best," Jeffrey stated firmly. "Sell to developers if the financial security and fresh start appeal to you. Consider historical preservation if maintaining Rosewood's legacy matters more. But whatever you decide, it should be your choice alone, without manipulation from Vanessa or obligation to Patrick." I studied them both, searching for signs of hidden agenda or calculation, finding instead what appeared to be genuine concern and respect. "Thank you for your candor," I said finally. "I admit, it's not what I expected from this lunch." Victoria smiled wryly. "We've spent too many years watching our daughter navigate life through careful calculation rather than honesty. Perhaps we're finally learning from her mistakes." Our main courses arrived, the conversation shifting to lighter topics: Victoria's work as a curator at a London museum, Jeffrey's plans for semi-retirement, their fondness for Vermont's landscape. By the time we finished our meal, I felt I'd gained not just insight into Patrick and Vanessa's dynamic, but also unexpected allies. As Jeffrey paid the bill, politely but firmly refusing my offer to contribute, Victoria touched my arm lightly. "About Thursday's dinner, Vanessa will undoubtedly have an agenda. She always does. But please know that Jeffrey and I are not part of it." "I appreciate the warning," I replied. Though I suspect Vanessa is realizing her usual tactics may not work in this situation. "A valuable lesson, long overdue," Jeffrey observed dryly. We parted with genuine warmth, their promised support both unexpected and strangely comforting as I headed to my afternoon meeting with Rebecca. Whatever happened Thursday night, I would not be facing Vanessa's subtle manipulations alone. Rebecca's office was as welcoming as ever, though her expression when I entered carried a new intensity. "These figures," she began without preamble, gesturing to the printouts on her desk, "are exceptional, particularly the offer from Silver Lake Developments." I settled into the now familiar chair across from her. "What makes their offer stand out?" "Beyond. The numbers? Their approach?" She slid a glossy brochure across the desk. "They're proposing to maintain the main house's historical character while developing luxury condominiums on the surrounding acreage. It's not complete preservation, but it's a compromise that acknowledges Rosewood's architectural significance." Examined the brochure, tasteful renderings of the Victorian exterior preserved intact, with modern additions designed to complement rather than overshadow the original structure. "And the financial terms?" Rebecca's smile was restrained but genuine. "Life-changing. And they're prepared to include provisions guaranteeing you lifetime access to the gardens and certain public areas of the main house, should you wish to visit." "That's thoughtful," I said, genuinely surprised by this consideration for my emotional attachment to the property. "I thought so too." Rebecca leaned back in her chair. "Now, about the historical preservation options Jeffrey Harrington mentioned. I've Done some research there as well. The Vermont Historical Society has expressed preliminary interest in partnership with a private investor Jeffrey recommended. And how would that arrangement work? You would sell at somewhat below market value, though still a very comfortable sum, with significant tax advantages offsetting the difference. The property would be maintained as a bed and breakfast and historical site, with certain parts opened for educational tours. She pushed another document toward me. The financial comparison is detailed here. I studied both options, weighing the substantially higher offer from Silver Lake against the preservation approach that would maintain more of Rosewood's original character and purpose. Neither was a poor choice. Both would provide more than enough for my needs and whatever legacy I wish to leave. I don't need to decide immediately, do I? I asked finally. No, Rebecca assured me. Both parties understand this is a significant decision, but they would appreciate an indication of your inclination before making formal offers. I nodded slowly. And what about Patrick? You mentioned including him in these discussions. Rebecca's expression grew thoughtful. Given the nature of these offers, particularly the preservation option, it might be beneficial to gauge his reaction. Not for approval, the decision remains entirely yours, but to understand if his attachment to Rosewood is genuinely about the property's character or merely its monetary value. The distinction resonated deeply. If Patrick truly valued what Rosewood represented, the history we'd preserved, the sanctuary we'd created together, wouldn't he prefer the option that maintained those elements, even at a lower profit? I'll consider it, I promised. After Thursday's dinner, I want to understand where everyone stands before making any decisions. As I left Rebecca's office, the autumn afternoon was giving way to early evening, the mountains burnished with golden light that illuminated their peaks while casting the valleys into deepening shadow. I stood for a moment in the parking lot, breathing in the familiar scent of wood smoke and fallen leaves, allowing myself to imagine futures that had never before seemed possible. For the first time since Patrick's fateful visit, I felt not just anger or determination, but something approaching excitement. Whatever I decided about Rosewood, the choice would truly be mine, informed by my values, my desires, my vision for the years ahead. The realization brought with it an unfamiliar sense of expansiveness, as if the narrowing path I'd anticipated for my later years had suddenly opened into an unexplored landscape of possibility. Wednesday passed in a flurry of activity as I prepared for Thursday's dinner. Martha insisted we go shopping, for armor, as she put it. We drove to Burlington, where I purchased a tailored charcoal dress that managed to be both elegant and authoritative, paired with a deep burgundy wrap that Martha declared regal. You look like someone who makes million-dollar decisions over breakfast, she observed as I emerged from the dressing room. Is that the goal? I asked, studying my reflection with unfamiliar scrutiny. The goal is to remind Vanessa that you're not just Patrick's aging mother but a successful businesswoman in your own right, Martha replied. Besides, new clothes for a new chapter seems appropriate. I couldn't argue with that logic, though. The price tag gave me momentary pause. A lifetime of careful budgeting had created habits not easily broken. But as I handed over my credit card, I reminded myself that the preliminary offers for Rosewood made this indulgence insignificant by comparison. That evening, I received an unexpected call from Patrick, the first direct contact since our tense conversation on Saturday. "Mom," he began awkwardly. How are you?" "Fine, thank you," I replied, keeping my tone neutral. "How are your in-laws enjoying Vermont?" "They seem to be having a good time. They've been exploring on their own quite a bit." He paused. "Dad mentioned he had lunch with you yesterday." "Yes, Jeffrey and Victoria invited me to the Maple Tree Cafe. We had a lovely conversation." Another pause, longer this time. "What did you talk about?" I settled into Martha's comfortable armchair, noting the anxiety in my son's voice. Many things. Their impressions of Vermont. Victoria's work at the museum. The future of Rosewood. And what did they say about that? Patrick's attempt at casual interest failed miserably. They were supportive of my decision to sell, I replied simply, and quite knowledgeable about historical preservation options. Historical preservation? Patrick sounded genuinely confused. As opposed to what? Development offers. I met with Rebecca yesterday to review preliminary proposals. The numbers are substantial. And you didn't think to include me in these meetings? The hurt in his voice seemed genuine. Given our last conversation, I wasn't sure you'd be interested in the details rather than just trying to change my mind, I explained. But Rebecca suggested I should gauge your feelings about the different options before making a final decision. What options? Now he sounded cautious, calculating. 2 primary paths forward. The first is accepting an extremely generous offer from a luxury developer who would maintain the main house's exterior while converting the interior and building high-end condominiums on the surrounding land. The second is a somewhat lower offer from a historical preservation group that would maintain Rosewood as a working inn and educational site. Silence stretched between us. When Patrick finally spoke, his voice carried a note I hadn't heard in years. Genuine curiosity rather than predetermined judgment. Which way are you leaning? I'm still considering, I answered honestly. The developer's offer would provide significant financial freedom. The preservation option would maintain more of Rosewood's character and purpose. I see. Another pause. Would it be helpful if we discussed it? Not to change your mind about selling, he added quickly, but to talk through the options? The olive branch was tentative but unmistakable. I'd like that, I said, surprised by how much I meant it. Perhaps after dinner tomorrow, once your in-laws have returned to their hotel? That would be good, relief colored his voice. Mom, He stopped himself. We can talk more tomorrow. Vanessa made reservations at Giovanni's for 7. I'll be there, I promised. After we hung up, I sat thoughtfully in the growing darkness of Martha's living room. Patrick's call suggested a shift I hadn't anticipated. Not full understanding or reconciliation, but perhaps the beginning of respect for my decision-making autonomy. Martha found me still sitting there when she returned from her book club meeting. Earth to Eleanor, she called, switching on a lamp. You look 1,000,000 miles away. I recounted my conversation with Patrick as she poured us each a glass of wine. Cautious optimism, she diagnosed after considering his words. He's realizing he can't stop the sale, so he's positioning himself to influence the outcome. That's rather cynical, I observed. Martha arched an eyebrow. Realistic, but I'll grant you this. His interest in preservation versus development might reveal whether he has any genuine attachment to what Rosewood represents, or just what it's worth. Exactly what Rebecca suggested, I nodded, and what I'm hoping to learn. Thursday dawned clear and crisp, the mountains outlined against a perfectly blue October sky. I spent the morning with Rebecca, reviewing the detailed terms of both potential offers and discussing negotiation strategies. Remember, she advised as our meeting concluded, you're in an extremely advantageous position. Both parties are eager, the property is unique, and you have no pressing timeline. Use that leverage. In the afternoon, I found myself drawn to visit Rosewood itself, the first time I'd returned since leaving Friday evening. Martha offered to drive me, but this was something I needed to do alone. The familiar curve of the driveway, the copper beech tree whose leaves were now a brilliant russet, the wraparound porch where I'd sat through countless summer evenings. Each site evoked memories so layered they formed the very foundation of my identity. For 35 years, this place had been more than my home and business. It had been my anchor, my achievement, my daily affirmation that a single mother with limited resources could create something of lasting beauty and value. I parked behind the house, using my key to enter through the kitchen door. Patrick and Vanessa's rental car was gone. Likely they had taken her parents sightseeing before our dinner engagement. The house was silent, though I noted subtle signs of occupation. A different coffee mug left by the sink, an unfamiliar scarf draped over a chair, a London newspaper on the counter. Moving through the rooms, I allowed myself to truly see the house as it was, not just as the repository of my memories. The parlor where I'd served afternoon tea to guests needed reupholstering. The dining room's hardwood floors had worn thin in high-traffic areas. The library's ceiling showed faint water stains from last spring's heavy rains. Maintaining rosewood had always required constant attention and reinvestment. At 68, did I want to continue that endless cycle of preservation against natural decline? Or was it time to entrust that responsibility to others, either developers who would transform the space or preservationists who would maintain its essential character? I climbed the stairs to my bedroom, steeling myself for whatever changes Vanessa might have made to accommodate her parents. The door stood slightly ajar. I pushed it open to find the room transformed exactly as I had feared. My handmade quilt, replaced with an impersonal duvet in muted tones, my family photographs removed from the bedside table, my reading chair repositioned to create what Vanessa probably considered a more efficient flow. Instead of the anger I'd expected, I felt a strange detachment. This sterile, tasteful arrangement confirmed what I already knew. Vanessa saw Rosewood not as a home infused with memory and meaning, but as an asset to be optimized. I retreated downstairs and out to the gardens, walking the stone paths I'd installed over decades, pausing beside the perennial beds now preparing for winter dormancy. The Japanese maple I'd planted when Patrick graduated high school blazed scarlet against the weathered gray of the garden shed. If I accepted the developer's offer, much of this landscape would be sacrificed for condominium buildings and parking. If I chose the preservation route, the gardens might remain largely intact, though whether future caretakers would maintain them with the same devotion remained uncertain. No perfect answer emerged from my contemplation, but by the time I returned to Martha's to prepare for dinner, I had a clearer understanding of my priorities. The physical structure of Rosewood, while beloved, was ultimately less important than what it represented. The independence I'd fought for, the sanctuary I'd created, the legacy I hoped to leave. The question was no longer which offer would best preserve Rosewood, but which would best honor what Rosewood had meant while allowing me the freedom to write the next chapter of my life. Martha whistled appreciatively when I emerged from the guest room in my new dress and wrap, hair freshly, styled, subtle makeup enhancing my features. "Giovanni's won't know what hit it," she declared. "You look magnificent." "Is it too much?" I asked, suddenly uncertain. "I don't want to appear as if I'm trying too hard." "Nonsense. You're a woman of substance about to have dinner with people who need reminding of that fact." She handed me the small clutch purse we'd purchased to complement the outfit. "Now, go show Vanessa what real confidence looks like." Giovanni's occupied a restored mill building at the edge of town. Its stone, walls and exposed beams creating an atmosphere of rustic elegance. As the host led me to the reserved table, I spotted Patrick and Vanessa already seated with her parents, their heads bent in conversation that ceased abruptly as I approached. Jeffrey rose immediately, his warm smile a welcome contrast to Vanessa's carefully composed expression and Patrick's obvious nervousness. "Eleanor, you look wonderful," Jeffrey greeted me, pulling out my chair with old-world courtesy. "Indeed," Victoria agreed. "That shade of burgundy is perfect with your coloring." "Thank you?" I smiled, noting Vanessa's quick assessment of my outfit. "It's new. A small indulgence." Conversation flowed with surprising ease through appetizers, neutral topics like the foliage season, local attractions Victoria and Jeffrey had visited, the restaurant's award-winning wine list. It was only as our main courses arrived that Vanessa steered the discussion toward the subject that had brought us together. "Eleanor," she began, her tone carefully modulated. "Patrick mentioned you've been exploring options regarding Rosewood." "Yes," I confirmed, meeting her gaze directly. "I've received 2 very interesting preliminary offers." "Preliminary offers," she repeated, exchanging a quick glance with Patrick. "So nothing has been decided?" "Not yet," I agreed. "Both have compelling elements. I'm weighing the financial advantages of the development proposal against the historical integrity of the preservation option." Victoria leaned forward with genuine interest. "What would the preservation entail? Would Rosewood continue as a bed and breakfast?" "Yes, though with an expanded educational component. The Vermont Historical Society would be involved, offering tours and workshops on Victorian architecture and restoration techniques." I found myself warming to the concept as I described it. Much of what made Rosewood special would be maintained and shared. "That sounds wonderful," Victoria enthused, "preserving not just the structure, but its purpose and connection to the community." Vanessa's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "While that's certainly a charming concept, I imagine the development offer is substantially more practical from a financial perspective." "Both would provide more than enough for my needs," I replied evenly. "The decision hinges more on what I want Rosewood's legacy to be." "Legacy is important," Jeffrey agreed. "But so is maximizing the value of assets you've spent decades building. You've earned the right to prioritize your future comfort." I sensed Vanessa relaxing slightly, clearly interpreting her father's comment as support for the more lucrative development option. What she missed was the emphasis on my right to choose based on my own priorities. Patrick, who had been uncharacteristically quiet, finally spoke. "Mom, whichever way you're leaning, I'd like to understand your reasoning. This isn't just about money. It's about 35 years of your life." The sincerity in his voice caught me by surprise. Perhaps Jeffrey and Victoria had been right about Patrick's conflicted feelings. "That's exactly why I wanted to discuss the options with you," I said, meeting my son's gaze. "After dinner, perhaps?" He nodded, something like relief crossing his features. The remainder of the meal passed pleasantly enough, though I noted Vanessa's growing tension beneath her polished social veneer. As we finished our desserts, she launched what was clearly a prepared speech. "Eleanor, before we conclude this lovely evening, Patrick and I would like to propose what we believe could be an ideal solution." She glanced at her husband for support. "One that acknowledges your desire for change while preserving family connections to Rosewood." I set down my coffee cup, maintaining a neutral expression. "I'm listening." Vanessa leaned forward, her perfectly manicured hands clasped on the table before her. "Rather than selling Rosewood to strangers, why not keep it in the family? Patrick and I could purchase the property from you, at full market value, of course." The proposal hung in the air, seemingly reasonable yet loaded with implications. I glanced at Patrick, whose expression revealed this wasn't a spontaneous suggestion, but a carefully planned strategy. "We've spoken with our financial advisor," Vanessa continued into the silence. "With some portfolio adjustments and a mortgage, we could match the developer's offer. You'd receive the same financial benefit without losing Rosewood to outsiders." Jeffrey's eyebrows rose slightly, this clearly being the first he'd heard of his daughter's plan. Victoria's expression remained carefully neutral, though I detected a hint of concern in her glance toward me. "That's an interesting proposal," I said carefully, "though I'm curious about your intentions for the property." Vanessa's smile brightened, sensing potential receptiveness. "We'd maintain the main house as a weekend retreat, of course. The surrounding acreage has tremendous potential, perhaps not as densely developed as the commercial proposal, but with select upscale cottages for our friends from Boston. A private enclave of sorts. And my gardens? The historical elements I've spent decades restoring?" "We'd preserve the essential character," Vanessa assured me, though her slight hesitation spoke volumes, with updates to align with contemporary tastes naturally. "The foundation is solid, but fresh vision would enhance the property's potential. I took a deliberate sip of my coffee, using the moment to collect my thoughts. And what about the community? Connections, the historical society tours, the garden club meetings, the local artisans who've used rosewood for their showcases. Patrick shifted uncomfortably. Mom, those activities were part of running Rosewood as a business. If it's our private home, it would become an exclusive retreat rather than a community resource, I finished for him. Is that necessarily negative? Vanessa countered smoothly. Resources evolve, communities change. What matters is preserving family connection to a place that holds so much history for you and Patrick. I studied my son, searching for something in his expression, a flicker of understanding about what Rosewood truly meant, beyond its monetary value or status potential. Patrick, is this what you want? To transform Rosewood into a private weekend estate? His eyes met mine briefly before dropping to his dessert plate. I think it's a practical solution that benefits everyone. You get the full value of the property, and we maintain the family connection. But is it what you want? I pressed gently. It's what makes sense, he replied, the non-answer revealing more than perhaps he intended. Victoria set down her coffee cup with a decisive clink. If I may offer an observation? Her tone made it clear this wasn't actually a request. Eleanor, you've created something extraordinary at Rosewood. Not just a beautiful home, but a living piece of history that has served the community while supporting your family. Whatever decision you make should honor that achievement. Vanessa's smile tightened almost imperceptibly at her mother's intervention. That's precisely our intention, Mother. To honor Eleanor's work by keeping Rosewood in the family. By transforming it into something unrecognizable, I noted quietly. By acknowledging that time moves forward, Vanessa countered. Nothing remains frozen in amber, Eleanor. Jeffrey cleared his throat. Perhaps this conversation would benefit from a pause for reflection. Eleanor has presented 2 thoughtful options already under consideration. Now there's a third. All deserve careful thought rather than immediate decision. I gave him a grateful glance. Precisely. I appreciate your proposal, Vanessa Patrick. I'll consider it alongside the others. Patrick looked like he wanted to press further, but Vanessa laid a restraining hand on his arm. Of course, we understand this is significant. We just wanted you to know there's a family option available. The bill arrived, saving us from further discussion. Jeffrey insisted on paying despite Patrick's token protest, and soon we found ourselves standing outside the restaurant in the crisp evening air. Victoria and I will take a cab back to the hotel, Jeffrey announced. Perhaps Eleanor and Patrick could have that private conversation they mentioned. Vanessa hesitated, clearly reluctant to be excluded. We could all continue this at Rosewood. I'm sure Eleanor would like to check on the house. Actually, I interjected gently, I promised Patrick we'd talk just the 2 of us. Perhaps tomorrow would be better for a full family discussion. Before Vanessa could object, Victoria linked arms with her daughter. Perfect. Jeffrey and I could use your help planning the remainder of our stay, darling. So many lovely sights still to see. With surprising efficiency, the Harringtons ushered Vanessa into a waiting taxi, leaving Patrick and me standing alone on the sidewalk. Would you like to walk? I suggested, gesturing toward the town green where colorful lights illuminated a canopy of maple trees. It's a beautiful evening. Patrick nodded, falling into step beside me. We walked in silence for several moments, the familiar rhythm of moving together, unlocking memories of countless walks throughout his childhood. To the library, to school events, through these same town streets during holiday celebrations. Your in-laws are not what I expected, I commented as we reached the green, settling onto a bench overlooking the gazebo where summer concerts were held. Patrick gave a short laugh. They're not what Vanessa expected either this visit. I've never seen her so wrong-footed by her parents. They're impressive people, I observed, particularly in their willingness to speak directly. Unlike their daughter? Patrick's voice carried a hint of defensiveness. Unlike most people, I corrected gently. Honesty becomes more valuable as it grows rarer. Another silence stretched between us, more comfortable than the last. Around us, the town settled into evening rhythms, couples strolling hand in hand. Teenagers gathered near the old-fashioned ice cream parlor, the distant sound of music drifting from the pub on the corner. "Why didn't you tell me how you felt?" Patrick asked suddenly. "About the basement arrangement, about how Vanessa and I treated you. Why wait until you were ready to sell Rosewood?" The question caught me by surprise. Not its content, but the vulnerability behind it. For the first time since this conflict began, my son sounded more confused than calculating. "I did tell you," I replied softly. Not in those exact words, perhaps, but every time I declined Vanessa's suggestions for updating rooms filled with memories. Every time I explained why certain outdated features were historically significant. Every time I invited you both to garden club events or historical society meetings and you declined. "Those weren't conversations about feelings," Patrick protested. "They were about decorating preferences or scheduling conflicts. They were about values, Patrick, about what matters, about whether history and continuity and community connection have meaning beyond monetary value." I turned to face him directly. The basement arrangement was just the culmination of a pattern that's been building for years. He looked away, his profile against the evening sky so like his father's, it momentarily caught my breath. "I never meant to make you feel unvalued." "No," I acknowledged, "but intention doesn't negate impact. And the cumulative impact has been the growing recognition that you and Vanessa see Rosewood very differently than I do. Not as a living history to be preserved, but as an asset to be optimized." "Is that so wrong?" Patrick asked, though without his wife's conviction. "Times change. Properties evolve." "There's nothing inherently wrong with change," I agreed. "The question is, what's lost in the transformation? When you and Vanessa talk about Rosewood, you never mention the families who've celebrated anniversaries there, the gardens that have provided sanctuary for the community, the architectural details we preserved when everyone said it would be cheaper to replace them." Patrick was silent for a long moment. "I remember those things," he said finally, his voice quieter. "The summer we rebuilt the gazebo from original blueprints. The Christmas we hosted the children's choir when the church furnace failed. The history award you received for the restoration work." Something eased in my chest at his words. The first real evidence that the son I'd raised still existed beneath the veneer of the Boston investment banker. "Then help me understand," I said gently. "If you remember, if those things matter to you, why would you support Vanessa's vision of Rosewood as a private weekend retreat? Why close it off from the community that helped build it?" He sighed heavily, running a hand through his hair in that familiar gesture of discomfort. "It's complicated, Mom. Vanessa has very specific ideas about what our life should look like. The right address, the right social connections, the right everything. And a historic Vermont inn open to the public doesn't fit that image," I suggested. "Not unless it's transformed into something more exclusive," he acknowledged reluctantly. "She sees Rosewood as the missing piece in our social positioning, the country estate that completes our portfolio." "And what do you see when you look at Rosewood?" Patrick stared at the gazebo, illuminated now by the gentle glow of landscape lighting. "Home," he said simply. "I see home." The word hung between us, weighted with memory and meaning. For the first time since this conflict began, I glimpsed the child I'd raised within the man he'd become, the boy who had helped me plant gardens and restore woodwork and welcome guests from around the world. "Then why support Vanessa's proposal?" I asked, softly. "Why not advocate for the preservation option that would maintain what makes Rosewood special?" He turned to me, conflict evident in his expression. "Because I'm caught between two worlds, Mom. The one I grew up in, where value was measured in community connection and historical significance, and the one I live in now, where everything has a price tag and status is the ultimate currency. And if you had to choose? I pressed gently. If this weren't about me or Vanessa, but about what you truly believe is right for Rosewood? Patrick was quiet for so long I thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a resignation that broke my heart a little. I don't know anymore. I've spent so long trying to balance between your values and Vanessa's that I'm not sure which are actually mine. He looked at me directly, vulnerability evident in his gaze. But I do know that whatever you decide about Rosewood, I need to respect it. I haven't been doing that, and I'm sorry. The simple apology, offered without qualification or expectation, cracked something open between us. Not full reconciliation, not complete understanding, but perhaps the beginning of a more honest relationship. Thank you, I said simply. We sat together in companionable silence, watching as the town green gradually emptied, locals heading home for the night, shops closing their doors. The version of Patrick beside me felt more authentic than the polished professional who had stood in my kitchen with Vanessa, discussing my relocation as if I were a piece of furniture to be conveniently shifted. For what it's worth, he said finally, I think the preservation option sounds like the right fit for Rosewood. It honors what you built while allowing you the freedom to start your next chapter. Really? I couldn't hide my surprise. He nodded, slowly. Vanessa won't be happy, but this shouldn't be about what makes Vanessa happy. It should be about respecting what Rosewood is and what you want for your future. For the first time in longer than I could remember, I felt a surge of genuine pride in the man my son had become. Not for his professional achievements or material success, but for the moral clarity emerging despite the competing pressures in his life. That means a great deal to me, Patrick. As we walked back toward our respective vehicles, a comfortable silence between us, I realized the weight I'd been carrying had lightened considerably. Not because all conflicts were resolved or all hurts healed, but because honest communication had finally broken through the careful fictions we'd been maintaining for years. Whether this newfound clarity would withstand Vanessa's inevitable resistance remained to be seen. But for now, in the quiet beauty of an autumn evening in the town where I'd raised my son, I allowed myself to hope that our relationship might emerge from this crucible strengthened rather than destroyed. Friday morning arrived with a clarity that seemed to mirror my own state of mind. My conversation with Patrick had affected me more deeply than I'd anticipated, stirring both hope for healing our relationship and resolve regarding Rosewood's future. After breakfast with Martha, I called Rebecca to schedule a final review of the proposals. I've made my decision, I told her, but I'd like to formalize the details before informing all parties. Wise, she approved. 11 this morning? I have all the documentation prepared. As I ended the call, Martha studied me over her coffee cup. You're looking remarkably serene for someone about to make a life-altering decision. I feel serene, I admitted, surprising myself with the truth of it. For the first time in years, I'm making a choice based entirely on what I want, not what others expect. And that choice is, Martha prompted, never one to tolerate unnecessary suspense. The preservation option, I replied. It offers less money but more meaning. Rosewood continues serving its purpose, and I gain the freedom to begin my next chapter. Martha nodded, satisfaction evident in her expression. I thought as much. It suits you, practical yet principled. Very Eleanor. There's something else, I added, reaching for my phone. I want to tell Patrick my decision before meeting with Rebecca. He deserves that courtesy after our conversation last night. Are you sure? Martha's skepticism was evident. He might try to change your mind, or worse, tell Vanessa and trigger another manipulation attempt. I considered this but felt surprisingly confident. I think Patrick and I reached a new understanding last night. Besides, I'm not seeking his approval, just extending the respect of keeping him informed. Patrick answered on the second ring, his voice carrying the careful politeness of someone uncertain where they stand. "Mom, good morning. I was just thinking about you." "Our conversation last night meant a great deal to me," I began. "Which is why I wanted you to be the first to know I've made my decision about Rosewood?" A brief pause. "And?" "I'm accepting the historical preservation offer," I said simply. "Rosewood will continue as a working inn and educational site. The main house, gardens, and original outbuildings will remain largely unchanged, while I'll have the freedom and resources to start my next chapter." The silence stretched long enough that I wondered if we'd been disconnected. "Patrick?" "I'm here," he responded quickly. "I'm just processing." "It's the right decision, Mom. It really is. Rosewood deserves to be preserved, not transformed." Relief washed through me at his response. "Thank you for understanding. That means more than you know." "Have you told Vanessa?" "Yet?" His tone shifted slightly, anxiety creeping in. "No. I wanted to speak with you first, then formalize everything with Rebecca before informing others. Vanessa will undoubtedly be disappointed." "That's an understatement," Patrick sighed. "She was up half the night refining her proposal, convinced you'd see the logic of keeping Rosewood in the family." I chose my next words carefully. "I am keeping Rosewood in my extended family, the community that helped build it, the future, guests who will experience it, the historians who will study it. Just not in the private sense Vanessa envisioned." "I understand," Patrick said quietly. "And I'll try to help her understand too, though I'm not sure she's capable of seeing Rosewood as anything but a missed opportunity." "That's her right," I acknowledged. "We all see the world through our own particular lens." After ending the call on a note of cautious optimism, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. Whether or not Vanessa accepted my decision gracefully, Patrick's support had eliminated the fear of permanent family rupture that had shadowed my considerations. My meeting with Rebecca proceeded with efficient precision. Documents were reviewed, contingencies discussed, and by noon, I had formally accepted the preservation group's offer, with terms that protected both my financial interests and Rosewood's historical integrity. "Congratulations," Rebecca said warmly, as we concluded, extending her hand across the desk. "This is a significant moment both for you and for Vermont's historical landscape." "It feels right," I replied simply. "The beginning, rather than an ending." As I left her office, I noticed a text from Jeffrey Harrington. "Any chance you're free for coffee this afternoon? Victoria and I would love to chat before our dinner plans with Patrick and Vanessa." Intrigued, I responded with a suggestion to meet at the Bell Jar Cafe at 3. When I arrived, Jeffrey and Victoria were already seated at the same corner table Martha and I had occupied earlier in the week. Victoria rose to greet me with unexpected warmth. "Eleanor, thank you for making time. We're flying back to London tomorrow and wanted to speak with you privately before leaving." "I hope you've enjoyed your Vermont visit despite the complications," I said, settling into the chair across from them. Jeffrey's lips quirked in a hint of a smile. "Actually, the complications have made the visit rather more interesting than the usual tourist activities. But we wanted to speak with you about Patrick and Vanessa." "I've made my decision about Rosewood," I said directly, sensing they might be concerned about family tension. "The preservation option. Patrick is supportive, though Vanessa will likely be disappointed." Victoria and Jeffrey exchanged glances. "That's partly why we wanted to talk," Victoria began. "We've observed how Vanessa's fixation on acquiring Rosewood has affected her relationship with Patrick, not to mention with you." "It's not entirely her fault," Jeffrey added, his expression softening. "Victoria and I have been doing quite a bit of soul-searching about the values we instilled in our daughter. Parents can guide, but not determine who their children become," I offered, thinking of Patrick's journey from the values I'd tried to instill to the lifestyle he'd adopted. With Vanessa, Perhaps, Victoria acknowledged. But we certainly influenced Vanessa's equation of property with status, appearance with worth. She's applying those lessons with a zealousness that concerns us. What are you saying exactly? I asked, curious. Where this conversation was leading, Jeffrey leaned forward slightly. We're saying that whatever happens with Rosewood, we support your decision and will not allow Vanessa to manipulate family relationships based on her disappointment. We've enabled her sense of entitlement for too long. That's unusually direct, I observed, taken aback by their candor. At our age, circumspection seems an increasing waste of time, Victoria replied with a small smile. We've watched how Vanessa's ambitions have gradually isolated Patrick from his roots, from you, from this community, from the values that shaped him. We don't intend to be complicit in further damage. I appreciate that, I said sincerely. Patrick and I had a meaningful conversation last night. For the first time in years, I felt I was speaking with my son rather than Vanessa's husband. That distinction matters, Jeffrey nodded. Which brings us to our proposal. Proposal? I echoed, immediately wary after Vanessa's dinner suggestion. Victoria's expression softened. Nothing manipulative, I assure you. We've purchased tickets for that Mediterranean cruise you mentioned to Jeffrey, the one you've postponed for 15 years. Open-dated, fully transferable, business-class flights included, I stared at them, momentarily speechless. That's incredibly generous, but I couldn't possibly. Consider it an investment in family healing, Jeffrey interrupted gently. There are 2 sets of tickets, one for you to use however you wish, perhaps with Martha. The second for Patrick, alone. Understanding. Dawned slowly. You want me to invite Patrick to join me, without Vanessa? We think Patrick needs time away from Vanessa's influence to rediscover who he is and what he values, Victoria explained. And what better opportunity than traveling with the person who knew him before ambition and status became his primary metrics for success? The audacity of their suggestion left me momentarily stunned. Does Patrick know about this? No, Jeffrey admitted. And we're not suggesting you present it as our idea. Simply that when the time seems right, perhaps after the Rosewood transition is complete, you might consider inviting him. The tickets will be valid for 18 months. And what about Vanessa? Won't she be suspicious if Patrick suddenly decides to take a Mediterranean cruise with his mother? Victoria's smile held a hint of mischief that suddenly reminded me of precisely where Vanessa had inherited her strategic thinking, if not her values. Leave Vanessa to us. We've been contemplating a long overdue intervention regarding her priorities and behaviors. This situation has made clear we can no longer avoid that responsibility. As I left the cafe an hour later, the envelope containing cruise documentation tucked securely in my purse, I marveled at the unexpected allies I'd found in Victoria and Jeffrey Harrington. Their motives weren't entirely altruistic. They clearly hoped Patrick might reclaim the values they preferred before Vanessa's influence. But their insight and willingness to address their daughter's behavior directly impressed me. Martha was predictably skeptical when I recounted the conversation that evening. So, they're basically planning a decontamination program for Patrick. Wash away the Vanessa influence through sea air and mother-son bonding? That's a rather cynical interpretation. I laughed. I think they genuinely believe Patrick has lost touch with what matters to him. They're offering an opportunity for reconnection, not deprogramming. And you're considering it? Martha arched an eyebrow. A month at sea with the son who was ready to relegate you to the basement a week ago? I gazed out Martha's kitchen window at the darkening sky, considering the question seriously. A week ago, I would have said absolutely not, but after our conversation last night, I saw glimpses of the Patrick I raised, the one who understood why Rosewood matters beyond its monetary value. People don't change overnight, Eleanor. No, I agreed. But sometimes they remember who they were before they started changing. That's different. Before Martha could respond, my phone chimed with a text from Patrick. "Can we talk? I'm outside." Martha peered through the curtains. "Well, speak of the devil. Your prodigal son is pacing on my front lawn looking like he's either going to throw up or cry." I rose immediately. "I should go see what's happened." "Want me to make myself scarce?" Martha offered. "No need. We can talk on the porch." I grabbed a cardigan against the evening chill and stepped outside to find Patrick indeed pacing, his expression a mixture of anger and distress I hadn't seen since his teenage years. "Patrick, what's wrong?" He stopped abruptly, running a hand. Through hair already mussed from the same nervous gesture, repeated, "I told Vanessa about your decision, about the preservation option." "I assumed you would," I said carefully. "I take it she didn't respond well?" A bitter laugh escaped him. "That's putting it mildly. She's furious. Not just disappointed, Mom. Absolutely livid. Said you're deliberately sabotaging our future plans, that you're being selfish and short-sighted." I absorbed this without surprise. "I'm sorry she feels that way, but it doesn't change my decision." "I know that," he said quickly. "And I'm not asking you to reconsider. I'm here because—" He hesitated, vulnerability evident in his expression. "Because I defended your choice, Mom. I told Vanessa the preservation option was right for Rosewood, that it honored your legacy while securing your future, and now she's not speaking to me. The simple declaration, 'I defended your choice,' affected me more deeply than I could have anticipated. For years, Patrick had been Vanessa's echo, repeating her preferences, amplifying her priorities. This small act of independence represented a significant shift. "What do you need from me?" I asked gently. He looked momentarily lost, like the boy who used to appear in my doorway after nightmares. "I don't know. Understanding, maybe? Confirmation that I'm not crazy for thinking Rosewood deserves to remain what it is, rather than becoming what Vanessa wants to transform it into." "You're not crazy," I assured him, gesturing to the porch swing. "Come sit. Tell me exactly what happened." Patrick settled beside me on the porch swing, the gentle creaking of its chains a familiar soundtrack to countless conversations throughout his childhood. For a moment, we sat in silence, watching fireflies begin their evening dance. Across Martha's garden, "I never expected to feel so conflicted," Patrick finally said, his voice low. "When Vanessa first suggested buying Rosewood, it seemed like the perfect solution. You'd get the money, we'd keep the property in the family. Win-win." "But," I prompted, gently, "but when I heard you explain the preservation option, how Rosewood would continue welcoming guests, educating visitors about its history, remaining part of the community, something clicked." He glanced at me, vulnerability evident in his expression. "I remembered helping you replace the porch balusters using the original woodworking techniques. How proud I was when you insisted on historical accuracy even though it cost more. You were 14, I recalled, smiling at the memory. You complained incessantly about the extra work, but beamed when the Historical Society presented us with that preservation award." "I did," he acknowledged with a faint smile, "because it mattered. Quality mattered. History mattered. Doing things right mattered." His expression clouded. "Somewhere along the way, I lost sight of that." "What exactly happened with Vanessa tonight?" I asked, steering us back to the immediate situation. Patrick sighed heavily. "When I told her about your decision, she immediately started strategizing how to change your mind. Higher offer, better terms, emotional leverage, the works. When I suggested that perhaps the preservation option was actually the right choice for Rosewood, she looked at me like I'd grown a second head. And then? She accused me of undermining our future, said if I couldn't see how owning Rosewood would elevate our social position, I wasn't thinking clearly." He ran a hand through his hair again. Then she called her father, certain he'd back her position. When he instead suggested she respect your decision, she completely lost it. Started ranting about how everyone was conspiring against her, how she'd spent years planning for Rosewood to become our legacy estate. Years? I echoed, the confirmation of Vanessa's long-term designs both validating my suspicions and deeply saddening. Apparently, Patrick nodded grimly. She had digital design boards, renovation plans, even a social calendar for hosting the right people once Rosewood was ours. When I asked why she'd never shared these plans with me, she said, he hesitated. Said what? That I couldn't be? Trusted to understand the vision because I was too sentimental about the quaint little inn where I grew up. The bitterness in his voice was unmistakable. That's when I realized how little she actually knows me, or values what matters to me. I placed my hand gently on his arm, feeling the tension vibrating through him. I'm sorry, Patrick, truly. It's painful to realize someone you love sees the world so differently from you. The thing is, Mom, I'm not even sure it's about different values. He turned to face me directly. It's about whether values matter at all beyond what they can get you. Vanessa doesn't care about Rosewood's history or community significance. She only cares about how owning it would enhance our status. The insight revealed a maturity I hadn't seen in my son for years. That's a difficult recognition about someone you've built a life with. Patrick nodded slowly. When I left, she was on the phone with a real estate agent, already looking for comparable properties elsewhere, as if Rosewood could be replaced by any large house with the right address. He shook his head in disbelief. She doesn't understand that what makes Rosewood special can't be purchased. It was built through decades of care, community connection, and respect for history. No, I agreed softly. That can't be purchased. We sat in companionable silence for several minutes, the porch swing moving gently beneath us, the evening air carrying the scent of Martha's late-blooming roses. Something had shifted between as a return to honesty that felt both healing and bittersweet. What happens now? I finally asked. With you and Vanessa? Patrick exhaled slowly. I don't know. This isn't our first disagreement, but it's the first time I've seen so clearly how fundamentally different our values are. He looked at me with an openness I hadn't seen in years. I keep thinking about something you used to tell me when I was young. What's that? That the true measure of wealth isn't what you own, but what you contribute. A small smile touched his lips. I used to believe that. Somewhere along the way, living Vanessa's version of success, I forgot. The simplicity of his admission brought tears to my eyes. It's never too late to remember what matters to you, Patrick. He nodded slowly. I think I need some time to figure out exactly what that is. He glanced at me hesitantly. Would it be okay if I stayed here in town for a few days? Not at Rosewood, maybe at the Williams Hotel, but nearby. To think. To remember. Of course, I said immediately, though I suspect Martha would gladly offer her guest room if you asked. As if on cue, Martha's front door opened slightly. The guest room has fresh linens, she called without preamble. And there's leftover lasagna in the fridge if you're hungry. Patrick laughed for what sounded like the first time in days. She was listening the whole time, wasn't she? Naturally, I smiled. It's Martha. I accept the offer, Patrick called back. And thank you. After Martha retreated inside with a satisfied nod, Patrick turned back to me. You've chosen good friends, Mom. I have, I agreed. Though Rosewood brought many of them into my life, another value the preservation option honors. The connections. That matter will continue. Patrick was quiet for a moment. I've been thinking about what happens after the sale. Where you'll go, what you'll do. I've put a deposit on a condominium in Burlington, I told him. Not too far from the lake. Single level, living, modern amenities, walkable neighborhood. That sounds perfect for your day-to-day life, he nodded. But what about adventures? You always talked about traveling once you retired, but Rosewood kept you rooted here. I thought of the cruise tickets tucked away in my purse, Jeffrey, and Victoria's unexpected gift. Actually, I'm considering a Mediterranean cruise next spring, something I've postponed for too long. Patrick's eyes lit with genuine interest. Really? That sounds wonderful. Which ports? Barcelona, Monaco, several. Stops in Italy, the Greek islands, ending in Istanbul. I studied his expression, seeing the curiosity there. You know, it's a rather extensive itinerary. I'd welcome company for at least part of it. Company? He echoed, surprise evident in his voice. If you were interested, I said carefully. No pressure, of course, just an opportunity to see some beautiful places together. The suggestion hung between us, fraught with significance beyond a simple travel invitation. Patrick seemed to recognize this, his expression turning thoughtful. I'd like that, he said finally. Very much. 3 months later, I stood on the balcony of my Burlington condominium, watching early February snow drift lazily past my window. The mountains in the distance were familiar, yet viewed from a new perspective, much like my relationship with Patrick. The sale of Rosewood had been finalized the previous week, the terms exactly as Rebecca had negotiated. The Historical Preservation Group had already begun preparations for reopening the inn in the spring, with my consultation on traditional operations. My new home was smaller but perfectly suited to my needs, filled only with furnishings and mementos I'd chosen to keep. My phone chimed with a text from Patrick. Tickets confirmed for April 15th. Can't wait. Should I brush up on my Italian? I smiled. As I typed my response, absolutely. And your art history. The museums alone are worth the trip. His reply came quickly. Looking forward to it. Also, took your advice about the therapist. First appointment tomorrow. The simple message represented significant progress. After staying at Martha's for nearly a week in October, Patrick had returned to Boston with new clarity about what he wanted from his life and marriage. Vanessa's initial fury had given way to reluctant couples counseling, though Patrick had confided that he wasn't optimistic about bridging their fundamental differences in values. Whether their marriage survived remained uncertain, but Patrick had begun the essential work of rediscovering his own principles, independent of Vanessa's influence. Our weekly phone calls had evolved from awkward to genuine, his voice increasingly carrying the thoughtfulness and warmth I remembered from years past. Martha joined me on the balcony, 2 steaming mugs of cocoa in hand. Good news? She asked, nodding toward my phone. Patrick's confirmed for the cruise, I replied, accepting the cocoa gratefully. And he's starting therapy. Wonders never cease, Martha observed wryly. Next, you'll tell me Vanessa has donated her designer wardrobe. To charity, I laughed. Let's not expect miracles, but Patrick is finding his way back to himself, and that's enough for now. Martha clinked her mug against mine in a toast. To new beginnings, and to Eleanor Caldwell, who refused to be banished to the basement and ended up transforming not just her own life, but her son's as well. As we stood watching snowflakes dance against the twilight sky, I reflected on how differently things had unfolded from what I'd anticipated that Sunday afternoon in October. I'd expected the sale of Rosewood to mark an ending, the conclusion of a chapter defined by that beloved property. Instead, it had catalyzed beginnings I couldn't have imagined. A new home, a healing relationship with Patrick, unexpected friendships with Jeffrey and Victoria, and the freedom to finally pursue dreams long deferred. The life I now inhabited was entirely of my own design, shaped by choices made with clarity and purpose rather than obligation. In releasing Rosewood to its future as a preserved historical inn, I had reclaimed ownership of something far more valuable, my own story, continuing beyond the boundaries of the house I'd built, expanding into possibilities limited only by my courage to pursue them. The basement my son had intended for me had instead become the foundation for a life rebuilt on my terms. And for that unexpected gift, I was profoundly grateful. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up, just click and check them out.